Thank you. How do you hear me? Am I coming across clearly at the head table there? Great. Well, I should probably explain to you first how a naval navigator comes to be talking to you about practical experience as an ice navigator in the North. And it's Ken Penny's story about going to headquarters and being responsible for closing half the Air Force that reminded me that I had a similar experience. After I was XO in a destroyer here, I got posted to Ottawa to a single desk, being responsible only for myself and the 1995 base closures plan. And so I did what any reasonable seagoing officer would do at that point. I started packing my parachute. And so I wrote off my exams as a master mariner, and the next year I got promoted and my career continued, and I didn't really look back. Except by the end of my career, I still had this ticket, and a friend of mine said, hey, go on this ice navigation course and I can get you some really jammy rides in the Arctic during the summer. And so I said, yes, please. So that's what I'm doing, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. I'm going to talk to you about shipping challenges and maritime security. Not really heavy on the maritime security, and I have no intelligence secrets to share with you. In fact, I see that there's a couple individuals here that are probably better read in Arctic security than I am. But I'm going to offer you my perspective from a practical point of view, and I'm going to tell you how I spend my summers and what sense I make out of some of the mythologies about the Arctic. So who owns the Arctic? This is the title of a book that was written by Dr. Michael Byers some years ago, and I think it's kind of a common theme when people think about the Arctic. They want to own it. And back in 2007, passions were inflamed by the Russians placing a flag on the sea bottom at the North Pole, and everyone kind of, well, not everyone, some people went away from that saying, God damn it, the Russians have claimed the North Pole. Well, that's largely for appearances. And a lot of what is about the Arctic is about appearances. Even this quote here, we're looking at a picture of Stephen Harper and his defense minister of the day standing with the frigate's captain in the Northwest Passage. And I would say, except for a few spots of white on the horizon, this could be a good summer day in Harrow Strait. But the message was clearly, the Arctic is ours and we're here to defend it. But even at that time, there was evidence that Stephen Harper didn't believe his own rhetoric. And so I'm going to address some of that as we go forward. There's different ways of defining the Arctic. This is one of them. And this is interesting because it's a particularly American defense perspective of the Arctic. And the circle, of course, is the Arctic Circle. But this part is interesting, the Bering Sea. And that's defined as Arctic by the Americans for climatological reasons and geopolitical reasons. But when you hear that 3 Chinese ships have been in the Arctic this past summer, it's not here, it's here. Okay, and that's completely different. So we're going to talk about definitions of the Arctic as we go forward. Canadians are apt to define the Arctic in terms such as this. And this is a colored plot that shows the different coastlines that were discovered by various European voyagers, largely Royal Navy officers in the 1800s. The interesting thing is Canada owns all of this by right of deed from the UK in 1880. But that didn't really sort out our sovereignty and ownership of those lands. In fact, many of these lands, these green ones here, were only explored by Norwegians in the early part of the 1900s, 1902, 1904. And it's S for Sverdrup, who was a colleague of Fridtjof Nansen, and took the Fram up into these waters and explored all of this. And so Canada's claim to those was only really settled in the 1930s when we settled up with Sverdrup and bought his records, and the Norwegians agreed to let go of any claim they might have had on that. Interestingly, the last islands defined here were defined by aerial surveys in the post-World War II area. So the whole aspect of the definition of the Arctic is a relatively new thing in terms of naval and maritime history. In other ways, the Arctic has been defined by defense interests for a very long time, starting just after the war with the construction of the DEW Line. We're seeing HMCS Labrador here with 3 U.S. Coast Guard cutters in line abreast or line astern. And then through the 1960s, 70s, various things sparked interest in the North. And so there was a Canadian reaction of saying, this is ours, we own it, we're going to defend it. And that led to certain developments in terms of the Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act in response to the Manhattan sailing. If anyone's going to steam a tanker through our north, we better know about it, and we better have a plan to mitigate any possible pollution. And then after the transit of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Polar Sea in 1984, that's when we got serious about declaring baselines and a defense white paper that proposed that we would have a fleet of nuclear submarines. Well, that didn't happen for various reasons, but all of this was a bit of a cause célèbre in the media, and it wasn't as if the Americans were trying to challenge our sovereignty. In fact, that whole transit had been well discussed between the U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Navy, Canadian Coast Guard, and the only people that didn't know about it were CBC, and so they ran the red flag up and made a big deal about it. But in any case, the result of that was what we know now about Canada's claim to the Arctic. And this is a bit of an eye test, as some of these slides are, but I'm going to explain the stuff that you really need to hoist in. The dark line here is the 12-mile limit of Canada's territorial waters. And so by extended baselines across some of these wider straits, Canada's managed to enclose all of this and claimed everything inside as internal waters. And then that dash line there is 100 miles, and the outer one is 200 miles. So after the Polar Seas transit through there, we declared the straight baselines and extended the 200-mile limit, and decided that we were going to exercise control for safety and security and environmental protection over those waters. Now, the one thing you need to remember is the dark line here, the territorial waters, that's what we properly call Canadian waters and everything inside that. But a lot of people mistake this line as enclosing Canadian waters. It's not. Okay, and that's where most people get confused between issues of sovereignty, in terms of having full sovereignty over the land and the water, and the extended rights of economic exploitation and environmental stewardship that pertains to the 200-mile limit. And I'm going to say a bit more of that as we go along. So when we talk about voyages in the Arctic, generally the statistics are calculated on vessels that are within Canada's 200-mile limit, because that's the area over which Transport Canada exercises oversight. And this is what the record of transit through the Northwest Passage looks like. So a fairly sparse record from 1906, 2 to 6, when Amundsen went through Angola, through the Sun Rock and HMCS Labrador. There's Manhattan in 69, and then it begins to get fleshed out a little more regularly year by year. And what you'll notice here is that in recent years, in 2018, not very many transits at all. I'll talk about that a little bit. But prior to that, a steady increase in the number of transits. But look what kind of vessels they are. The vast majority here are passenger ships, adventurers, and pleasure ships. Okay, so there's still not a lot of traffic through the Northwest Passage, and I'm going to update you on that as we go forward. Nevertheless, people get wrapped around the axle about Canada's claim over the Northwest Passage and whether people that differ with us in this claim are actually challenging our sovereignty. So this is a kind of a detailed slide, but what I'm saying here is the definition of Canada's definition of the Northwest Passage is this internal waters. So we have absolute control over who goes through there. Those that differ with us, principally our closest neighbors, have a differing opinion. They say that it's an international strait. And what that means is not necessarily that they challenge our sovereignty, but they challenge our interpretation and what it means for ships' ability to go through those waters. So if you have a ship going through territorial waters, a foreign ship can go through there under the cause of innocent passage, providing it sails in its normal configuration and it doesn't conduct any research or military activities. So what that would mean for submarines is that they have to transit surfaced. The difference with an international strait is that they can travel in any mode that suits them. So submarines can travel submerged. And so that makes quite a difference when you think about people going through the Northwest Passage. And so the Americans, understandably, with nuclear submarines, might not want to be declaring their transits in those ways. And so they're arguing for an international strait, whereas we say it's an internal water. And here's a number of arguments for and against it. The bottom line is the Americans are not serious about challenging our perspective. In fact, we have an agreement dating back to 1996 that says that we will cooperate in the Arctic without challenging each other's legal stance on this. But a lot of other people get wrapped around the axle and they falsely project this as a challenge to sovereignty, which it's not. Okay? The Americans have no claim over our Arctic islands, nor necessarily the waters in between. It's all about transit rights. And others, for various reasons, take their side on that so that they can exercise the difference of opinion for their own benefit. And it has a lot to do with precedents about maritime law in other places, such as the South China Sea, the Taiwan Straits, etc. We can come back to that if you want. The Northwest Passage, not one passage, although this is the most direct line through there. It's route number 1. But there's 7 distinct routes through there that are defined by the Scott Polar Research Institute. And some of them are more or less available depending on the time of year and the ice conditions of that particular season. So the red and purple line that comes down here through Peel Sound, Franklin and Victoria Strait, Coronation Gulf and D Strait, and then up through Amundsen Gulf here to the Beaufort Sea, that's route number 3. That's the route that is most commonly available and accessible to ships that are not icebreakers or not under escort of icebreakers. You'll note here in the round circles there's limiting depths. So some of these are quite narrow, quite shallow. This one here, this is Cache Point Channel, is 10 to 14 meters. Down in Simpson Strait it's 6 or 9 meters. This is where Amundsen came through. This one here, Fury and Hecla Strait, 10 to 22 meters, and 20 meters in Bellet Strait. Now Bellet Strait and Fury and Hecla Strait, they're also heavily tidal, so the current runs through there at 5 to 6 knots. Okay, so that's a particular hazard in itself. If you're going against the tide and you've got ice washing down on you, and you could be standing still, not going anywhere across the ground, but the ice is impacting you at 6 knots, that's not a good thing. So the pattern of transit has continued to be relatively thin over the past few years, and here we're talking again about full transits. So we're talking about from the Beaufort Sea all the way into Baffin Bay or vice versa. But there's been a difference in the number of cargo ships. So these green lines here are cargo ships, and you see that they're beginning to increase. And it's largely due to one company that's been running some small cargo ships through there. But largely speaking, the Northwest Passage, for reasons I'm going to explain, is not an attractive transit route. Notwithstanding all the hype over the past 20 years about an ice-free Arctic and a superhighway, Panama of the North, etc., it just is not happening, neither on our side nor the Russian side. This last year, 44 transits by 40 vessels, so a few of the Coast Guard vessels went through both ways, number of cargo ships, passenger vessels, but the large majority here is small ships, motor yachts and sailing vessels. Okay, I'll show you some more of that. And why is this happening? Climate change. So a couple charts here. This chart here is in May, and what that is showing is the sea ice thickness at the time when it's reached its maximum thickness and extent in the season. So you'll see the red stuff is the very heavy stuff in meters here at the bottom, 4 to 5 meters, and you see the heaviest stuff is along the northwest edge of the Canadian islands and across the top of Greenland. Much less thick on the Russian side here, extending across almost to the Bering Strait. These two charts here, the blue line represents the maximum ice volume in the year, in April or May, so that corresponds to this chart. And then the red line illustrates the minimum extent of ice, or the minimum volume of ice in September when it reaches its minimum. So when people talk about the end of ice, they're extending this red line and the trend line here till it reaches 0. And on this chart here, that would be out probably about 2040 or 2050. The implications of that are that when you no longer have ice for even a short period in the Arctic, you'll no longer have second-year ice. It'll all be first-year ice. It'll grow, and then it'll decay away, and then it'll grow again. And the importance of that is it's all this stuff here, the minimum extent of ice that stays to become second-year ice, then multi-year ice year over year. What happens to it is the salt from the seawater ice it leaches out of it, it becomes fresh water, it becomes harder and more dangerous and more durable, and it equates to the same kind of hardness as glacial ice. So that's a much greater danger for shipping. So the implications of that is not only that you would have no ice anywhere here, but in succeeding years you wouldn't have any of that dangerous second and third multi-year ice. But bear in mind this, see all that red stuff there? When we see the end of ice in the Arctic Basin, the very last place that we're going to be missing ice is the Canadian North Arctic, okay? And that stuff is going to become melting and more mobile, and it'll drift down through the islands here and encumber the Northwest Passage. So the ice is declining, and it's not yet gone. Now this slide is a bit of an eye test, but I'm going to explain it here because there's a sequence of slides that show how the season evolves. The thing you need to just hoist in is the red stuff is 9 to 10 tenths of ice coverage, so 90 to 100% total coverage of the sea surface. Okay, and then it descends through the orange and the yellow and the green to 1 to 3 tenths in the green. The blue stuff here is not, it's open water, but it's not ice-free. So the blue on this chart represents that part of the sea that might have 1/10 or less of ice. Okay, which doesn't sound like a lot, but what it means is if you're plowing through that at the dark at full sea speed, okay, you can still encounter some heavy ice, even some multi-year ice that could be a danger to the ship. So it's not just plain sailing through the blue stuff, it's only this white stuff down here that's ice-free. And this is the week of 31 July. So you're thinking that's high summer, but it's just the beginning of the navigational season in the north, okay, which extends from the end of July through to the end of October, depending on the ice capability of the ship. That's what it looks like in September, historically the minimal extent of sea ice. So you can see here we've got open water all the way through the Northwest Passage, except to here. Typically, this is last year, typically the ice in the Beaufort Sea rotates in this gyre, this clockwise gyre. It washes down here and through the islands, and so the western part of McClure Strait and Barrow Strait is still encumbered by heavy ice. That's why the common route is down this way and under Victoria Island. But here's September in 2018, a particularly bad year where even at the best of the season, this is the beginning of September, the Northwest Passage was seriously encumbered here. Ships could not get through to resupply the communities down in here, and the west was closed off here and also off of Point Barrow. And so that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the variability of the ice, but that kind of illustrates, you know, what's the best and the worst that you can expect even recently. Here's this particular year, 30th of September, so it's a month later, and the Northwest Passage, route number 1, is clear sailing all the way through. Now, not ice-free, but open water at least. So any ship without an ice class could safely make their way through this way, okay? At least in that week, okay? Okay, before that, the ice is still receding, and after that, it's beginning to grow a little bit. And it grows pretty quickly. This is a common plot here. The green line is the 30-year average, and the rest of this is for the weeks 2023 from mid-May through to end of November. So you can see there's a gap here in the middle where the ice coverage is very low, and then as it starts to melt, it really accrues very, very quickly. So that's what it looked like last week. So you can see very quickly what was plain sailing all the way through here is frozen solid, and so there's no more traffic through the Northwest Passage there unless you're a very heavy icebreaker and you can get through this stuff. Okay, and the ice is extending in the Beaufort Sea. It's going to close the coast of Northwest Territories in Alaska and close off that route, and Lancaster Sound here is already closed. So when we're planning passages in the north, what we usually do is we look at the areas we're going to go, and this is for the Northwest Passage. So it's in this small chart here, you can see the red areas. This is expressing coverage of the sea surface as a percentage. So you can see maximum of 30% and mostly down about 5 or 10%. But look at the variability of it here. And it's even worse than that because that's the percentage of the whole passage that's covered by ice. But if you're kind of thinking you're making your way through a maze here, you know, maybe a house with a number of doors, you're going to find your way through it, and there's one passage in the middle of the house that's got a door in it. There could be a 5% chance that all of the doors are open at once. But if there's a 90% chance that the key door in the middle of the house is closed, that's what this is about. And so when we look at the same time for a restricted point of area of the passage, and this area here is the area where Franklin was lost in Victoria Strait, you can see much heavier concentrations or coverage of the sea ice and huge variability from year to year. So you could go from, in a couple of years, from having 0 in a certain week, this is the 10th of September, to 30% coverage or more. And so when we look at that, we look at the prospects that we can get through, and then as ice navigators, what we do is we do some sums to compare the ship's ice class to the coverage of ice and the type of ice, and we determine whether it's safe to go. So this is one voyage in 2017. They finished an icebreaker Nordica, went from Vancouver through the Northwest Passage to Greenland, and some really sunny and very calm seas in the famously stormy Bering Strait, and then this in Victoria Strait. So we're looking down from the bridge from a height of about 70 feet. So these floes that are being turned on edge are 4 to 6 feet in thickness. So, 1 to 2 meters for sure. And this is a pretty heavy icebreaker, so she had no problem with that. But she did get stopped on a couple occasions, and we had to back off and find a way around the heavy ice. Later that same summer, I was the ice navigator in the Chinese research ship Zhulong, going through the same area. So this is later in the season, September. So this year, this was about the minimum extent of ice in Victoria Strait. So lots of heavy stuff there. If you can imagine being Franklin and trying to force a sailing ship through that, you'd see that you're not going anywhere fast. And if you're a month later than this and it's starting to freeze solid, you're looking forward to another winter in the Arctic as they did. And as you're looking out to the west, lots of heavy ice coming down the Tintoc Channel as well. I point out this because you can, or at least ice navigators can tell from looking at that, and just the freeboard, that is the height of the ice above the sea surface, that it's multi-year ice, and so it's harder, more dangerous, and not just that, the extent of it means that that's a significant amount of tonnage. So if you hit it, it's just not going to budge. These are the kind of ships that we're seeing go through the Northwest Passage. Now, a couple of these ships have not gone through the Northwest Passage. Fishing boats are generally restricted to Baffin Bay, and by international convention, deep-sea fishing is not permitted in the Arctic Basin. And this ship here, this is representative of the ships that are taking iron ore out of northern Baffin Bay, Baffin Island, but they go in and they go out to the east as well, so they're not doing transits. This ship is the one that I sailed in for the month of August in Greenland and central Canadian waters. And the rest of these ships are all ships that have done passages through the Northwest Passage. So ice class private yachts. This is the French ship Ponant, which has a second highest ice class in the world, and they can do scheduled trips to the North Pole anytime they want. This vessel is not one of those vessels. But this guy who I met in the Arctic this summer, he's over 80 years old. His crewmate and female passenger was probably in her mid-70s, and he was attempting his 9th and 10th transits of the Northwest Passage, 8 of which he's done in this boat, and several of which he's done solo. And he made it through to the west, and then for various reasons, he's laid the boat up in Tuktoyaktuk, and he's going to pick it up next year and continue back the other way. These other ships have been through the Northwest Passage. Here's a 10-meter fiberglass yacht. Does he have any business in the north? Well, he seems to think so. Anyways, just to give you an idea of how varied the traffic is. And then there's these guys. Do I need to say they're Texans? They styled themselves the Arctic Cowboys, and they paddled through the Northwest Passage in one season and established a record in doing so. I don't believe that they went with the boat loaded quite like that, But if you understand the English term cowboy to signify people that take unwarranted risks, I think they're well named. But there's a lot more that brings people into the Arctic. It's scenes like this, and these are taken from the cruise ship Scenic Eclipse, which I sailed in not this past year, but the year before. And of course, everyone's looking for the money shots of polar bears and wildlife, and sometimes you have the good fortune to get pretty close to it. So this video was taken by the ship's navigator from the bridge using his iPhone. So pretty close, and of course, you know, lots of oohs and ahs and people like that. The ship I just sailed in this summer, we had some even better pictures of a polar bear on top of an iceberg noshing a seal, and so that was pretty grim and graphic. Now there's other ways of defining the North, and this one speaks not to rights but to responsibilities and how the Arctic is divided in terms of search and rescue responsibilities. So you see there's Canada's pie there, and it's not a territorial claim that goes to the Northwest Pole or the North Pole, but it's our responsibility for search and rescue. Okay, and the thing to notice here is how much of the Arctic the Russian Federation owns in terms of that responsibility. Okay, not territorial responsibility, but the responsibility for search and rescue. It's a huge, huge area. And mainly this is entirely divided up between the Arctic coastal nations. So United States, Russia, Norway, Denmark, and Canada. And Iceland's there, but they're not really in the Arctic. And I'll illustrate that a bit better as we go on here. And there's a reason for dividing up the search and rescue responsibilities, because it's a very austere and unforgiving environment, and you have to be ready for whatever comes. So here's a number of famous, I won't say shipwrecks because they were, and the reason for that is a large part of the Arctic is not surveyed to what we call modern standards. Now that doesn't mean there's no surveying or no charts at all, but it means that there's not full bathymetric surveys. So in many of the charts, particularly if you're navigating on old charts, there'll be a line of soundings that goes up this way and a line of soundings that goes up this way and one that cuts across here. And if you want to go up the middle, you can't interpolate between the soundings. The reason it's white is because there's no soundings at all. It's truly don't know what's there. Okay? And so ships like this, he was following a line of soundings, but he was off by about 100 yards because he was using a different standard of navigation than those that had laid down the tracks probably 50 years before. And that's what happened to him. He's beached up to here. He's in about 4 meters of water here, and his stern is hanging over 100 meters. Fortunately for the 160 people who were on board, the ship was well and truly beached, and so they were able to stay there safely and continue their five-star cuisine until the Coast Guard turned up, roundly surveyed all around the ship, and then made plans to evacuate them and salvage the ship. And here's another one more recently. This was just last year, up the east coast of Greenland. A ship that should have been able to avoid this fate, but somehow they got on the putty. And I was going through a southern fjord at the time, and we noticed a Danish Coast Guard vessel beetling through the other way, but he was still 2 days south of these guys. Fortunately, no one was hurt. They managed to get the ship off on the next tide, and then they continued on their way. And grounding's not just the only hazard that we encounter up there. There can be some pretty nasty weather. This is a ship coming out of Baffin Bay with 75,000 tons of iron ore in the hold. It was blowing about 55 to 60 knots there. The ship had 12 knots run on, and we were making good about 1.5 knots. And just to put it in perspective, the height of the forecastle here is about 25 to 30 feet above waterline. And I was watching this and say, finally, I've got a picture of the waves that really tells the truth. You know, you take those money shots and you show it to your family, and it's never really quite as exciting as you remember, but this one was, and all I was thinking is, thank God the hatches are tight. So navigating the Arctic is really an exercise in balancing your purpose with the considerations and the risks. And so on the issue, on the left here, I got the kind of risk issues between the survivability of the ship and the routes and the economics all the way down here. And then on the right is, why would you go there to start with? And this list is not in any particular order, but defense is there, but it's really, in my way of thinking, down at the bottom, and hopefully SAR is there too. You need to have the capability for search and rescue, but most of the time you're hoping you really don't have to do it, because if it's a serious thing and people are going to be in the life rafts or on the ice for 2 or 3 days before the closest ship gets there, that's going to be a truly bad thing. But most of the purpose for going into the north is resupply, navigation aids, harvesting or fishing, ice escort for the Coast Guard, and then the resource piece that draws people in there. Here's 3 different ships who have been in the north, and some of them have done the Northwest Passage. Not the cargo ship, as I explained. They go into Milne Inlet on northern Baffin Island and back out to the east generally. But these ships represent the 3 different streams of traffic in the northwest into the Canadian Arctic. Now there's these guys here. This is a small ship, relatively small. It's about the same dimensions as a Canadian frigate, a little more tonnage. It's a Dutch company called Royal Wagenborg, and they run a number of these small ice-class cargo ships doing transits from the Far East back into Europe, and they go through the Northwest Passage just seasonally to transit from one side to the other. So they're going straight through and they're not stopping. This is the other stream, which is taking stuff into the Arctic. So these ships operate out of Montreal. It's the Transarctic de Gagné Company. And they're resupplying the northern communities. And so they come in there. In many of those communities, there's no piers, there's no infrastructure. So this ship comes in, it puts in a lighter in the water, it unloads a small tug, it puts the stuff on the lighter, and it kind of shuttles it to the beach, and that's how they resupply these communities. And these are the ships that in 2018 did not get to their appointed destinations because of the ice. And so a lot of that critical resupply had to be done at very great expense through airlifts. So that's just kind of illustrating some of the different types of ships. Notably, none of these are really full-size container ships. And the reason for that is there's just not enough incentive to go through the Northwest Passage, too much risk in timing for a service that is really like a shuttle service. It's like a bus route, container ships. They're picking up stuff and dropping off stuff, and they've got to make timings all the way along their route and back. So they're not using the Northwest Passage. There's another reason why people are not inclined to use the Northwest Passage, and it has to do with just the navigational constraints. So this is Cache Point Channel. It's right in the middle of Northwest Passage. As you remember, I said this is the most common route through there, just because it's most often accessible. And right in the middle here is Cache Point Channel with a limiting depth of about 14 meters. So if you're in a ship that draws 9 meters, you might draw these red lines and say, okay, that's where I'm going to go aground. And you draw a navigational track through there and you think, okay, that's good. That's the scale. So 4 miles from here to here. So you don't have a lot of room to stray from your track. But if you're drawing 12 or 15 meters, then you're going to draw the lines like this. Okay, so the blue is 15 meters, and then you'd have to have a track that looks like this. And that is altogether too difficult to do safely and confidently, given that all of this land is very low lying, so you don't get a good radar paint on it. For the navigators in the room, and I know there's a few, it's not really great for peril indexing, and you're really reliant on your GPS, and the bathymetry is too tortured to offer you a good guide to safe water either. So that's, and of course, if you're going to do that, if you really want to go through there, and your full load is 15 meters, you're going to have to give up a couple meters of cargo carrying capacity, and that might be your profit margin. So you're not going to do that. So when people talk about the incentives to go through the Northwest Passage, they're looking at tables like this that show the distances between, say, Rotterdam and Shanghai through Panama, Northwest Passage, Northern Sea Route, that's the Russian side, or Suez. And you look at there and you say, the one that has the distance advantage is the Northern Sea Route. Okay? But look at this column here. There's only a few of those routes that the Northwest Passage has any kind of advantage in terms of distance. So the positive arguments are shorter routes, fuel savings, and expedited voyage, but the negative side is this. Okay? Short navigational season, the speed is uncertain because if there's any kind of ice, you're going to have to slow down, so you're not going to make a timely voyage. You may even be stopped if you're ice classed and you're butting your way through ice, you're going to be expending more fuel, so you're not even going to have the fuel savings. You're going to pay more for polar training and certification, more for ice class construction, transit fees or ice-rated escorts, in additional insurance costs, all the rest of these. So by and large, it's just not adding up to a very attractive economic proposition for shipping companies. And Maersk, who sent one of their good-sized container ships through the northwest or northern sea route, the Russian side, in 2018, they said, you know, this was fine, but we're not planning to do this on a regular basis anytime soon. Here's another way of defining Arctic, and it has to do with the IMO and the Polar Code. Polar Code was introduced in 2017 to impose consistent standards of ship construction and training and outfit for northern waters, and training of navigators and crews for polar navigation. And it applies within what are defined as polar waters. So it's the 60th parallel, not the Arctic Circle, but the 60th parallel through Hudson's Bay and across here under Greenland, and then it comes up over top of Iceland and over to Russia. So Norway and Iceland are not within polar waters. And the reason for defining polar waters that way is it's related to the extent of sea ice, particularly of glacial ice and multi-year ice, the more dangerous types of ice. So even though you might encounter a little bit of ice up here, generally speaking, all this water here is going to be ice-free, and it's only within the polar waters that we need to conform with the Polar Code.
Well, you have that slide up. Could you show us where the iron ore is coming from at Baffin Island?
Yeah. So here's Baffin Island here, and iron ore is coming from here. Yeah. So it's people are familiar with the Inuit community of Pond Inlet. It's just to the east of there is Milne Inlet, and so we go about 20 miles south of Pond. Yeah. So the Polar Code, there's various ways of defining ships in terms of their ice class and their fitness for steaming in ice-covered waters. There's different types of rules: Canadian, Russian, Baltic rules, and then the International Association of Classification Societies polar rules. So this is the scheme under which the IMO has defined the requirements for ships in their construction and the training that goes with them in areas in which they can operate. And when we talk about the ship's suitability, they can use one or more of these, and you can affect a correspondence between them. But basically, we're talking about survivability, sustainability, damage control, and this here, mainly the structural strength and shell plating of the ship and the power. Okay, so all of that defines how ships can go through ice, what kind of impacts they can sustain, whether they've got enough power and maneuverability to get through the ice and to shoulder it out of the way. And then as navigators, ice navigators, we look at all of this and we look at the ship's ice class. The only thing that we can manage when we're doing the navigation is speed, because it's all about momentum and energy of impact. And as I said earlier, if you're looking at an ice flow that is 10 meters by 10 meters by 10 meters, you're going to be seeing something that's 10 meters by 10 meters by maybe 1.5 meters above the water, okay? But you're talking about close on 900 tons of ice. So if you hit it at 6 knots, okay, something's going to break, and it's probably not the ice. So that's one of the things that we do as ice navigators. We interpret the ice charts to determine where we can go, and then when we, that's the planning part of it, and then once we see the ice, it reverts to kind of a tactical consideration of, okay, how big is that? What type of ice is? What ice class do I have? Can I afford to hit that? Okay, I'm not going to hit that, but I can hit that, and then you make your way, and generally pretty slowly. So different ice classes. Here's 3 in the rough correspondences. I put this up just to illustrate that in that red box are the types of ice classes that pertain to the Navy's Arctic offshore patrol ships, Type A, 5-6, and the Canadian Coast Guard's vessels. So our heaviest icebreakers we have are PC-3s. I told you that the Penant ship is a PC-2, and the only people on Earth that have PC-1s are the Russians. So they're looking at ships that can go consistently through 3 meters of ice. In fact, several years ago, the the Ponant ship, Commandant Charcot, the one that I showed you the picture, he was in the dock here in Esquimalt, and I managed to visit on board, and Captain showed me the helicopter hangar just forward of the bridge, and I said, oh, you must use that for ice reconnaissance, so you know where to go. And he says, no, we don't need to, we just go. Because they also are good for 3 meters of ice, and in a pinch they could probably take 5 meters, and they might have to run at it a couple times. Lots of ships have ice classes in the world, but those that are Type A, so within that Type A and above, so the kind of the AOPS classification and higher, there's only about 400 odd of them. Okay, so there's a lot of ice class cargo ships and the like that can go into the Baltic or to the St. Lawrence Seaway in winter, but they're not suitable for Arctic work, primarily because their structure and their plating and their configuration is not suitable for the heavy ice, and particularly multi-year ice. And a lot of different flags, largely as a function of all this stuff being in different flags of convenience. But the ones that are very serious about ice are the usual suspects, if you like. Okay, so this table here is showing Type A and above in order of numbers from highest to lowest. So you can see that the Russians outclass everyone in terms of the number of ice-capable ships they have. And that's as a function of the responsibility they have over a very, very vast sea area that is icy for most of the year, and their investment in the higher classes of icebreakers as well. So Canada figures third in ice-breaking nations, and you see the Americans are quite a ways down here, and the Chinese are coming up. And a lot of people make a big deal about this, but these are largely science ships. But what is notable is that if I ordered this list in terms of the number of ice class ships overall, China would be near the top because they've got so many ice class cargo ships. And in fact, in many ways, they're dominating the world of merchant sailors. Here's the ice classes of our Canadian surface combatants. Combatant is probably too strong a word to use for this vessel down here. But the frigates can go through brash ice, by which I mean is kind of crushed and loose ice. And even then, it's risky because, brash ice, it can get into the sea base here and it can clog it up, and then you don't have the water flow necessary for engine coolings and the rest of it. This ship here, the AOPS, Arctic Offshore Patrol Ship, is a PC5, Polar Class 5. So it's good for about a meter of flat and level 10/10 of ice. Okay, so most ships, their ice classification is characterized in terms of what's the thickness of ice that they can sustain movement through. So this ship is designed to and has been proven to be equal to maintaining 3 knots through 1 meter of ice. So it's fairly substantial, but it's not an icebreaker per se, mostly because of its design function, the powering of it, and various other considerations. The people that own the icebreakers in Canada are the Coast Guard, and this is their plan for fleet renewal. So you've heard that we're going to build 2 polar icebreakers, one in Vancouver and one in Quebec, and these will be PC2. So that's a step up from what the Coast Guard has as their heaviest icebreakers now. There'll be 2 of those, and then 6 of the program icebreakers, 16 multi-purpose vessels that are PC5. So that's the same class as the AOPS, and there's the AOPS there. So the Navy's getting 6 of those vessels. The Coast Guard will get 2 more off of Irving's production line in Halifax. And then there's a couple other ships that have ice classes as well. So the Coast Guard is recapitalizing by way of the National Shipbuilding Procurement Strategy, 27 to 33 major as Type A and above ice-capable ships. Again, here's the people that are really serious about it. And the Russians have, and have had forever almost, a very significant ice-breaking fleet. That started back in the 20s, where we had only ever had one passage by a small yacht through the Northwest Passage. They were beginning to invest very heavily in transits through the Northern Sea Route. So many of these vessels, as noted, are nuclear. Some of them are shallow draft for operating in the northern rivers. And the reason for them having such a sustained fleet, or such a massive fleet, so here we are, 52 of CAC 4 and above, 126 Type A and above, is because they have so much infrastructure in resource development and extraction on their northern slope. That's what it looks like here. So there's a couple different graphs here, and you can't read the numbers, I know, but I'll just kind of talk through them to kind of give you an idea. Here's total cargo volume from 2011 to 2022. You see it's ramped up fairly substantial through to 2022 here, and that figure there is 34 million tons of cargo. So that's the amount of cargo shipped, you know, in and out and through the northern sea route. And the number of voyages here, again, is reasonably substantial, and it goes throughout the year because they have that kind of ice-breaking support, and they have ice-breaking cargo ships that are particularly bringing oil and gas out of the Yamal oil fields and the gas fields. But what I want to point out is these numbers here, which are the number of voyages, and we've got four years represented here, but those peak numbers in the summer for 1 month are equal to the number of voyages in Canada's northern waters for the whole year. So just to put it in comparison. And these are the number of transits. Again, similar to us, people are not seeing a lot of value in doing transits through the northern sea route. So they grew a little bit, and then they've fallen off in 2022 here, come back a little bit more in the last couple of years. But with all of those voyages in and out of the northern sea route, the numbers that are choosing to go through, just get from one side to the other, are very few by comparison. This is this year's figures up to the 30th of October. And of course, the year's not quite over, but you'll see here in this table, the majority of that traffic, pretty well all of it actually, is either between Russian ports or between Russian and Chinese ports. And there's only this one voyage that was from Russia to the Netherlands. So again, not very many people, other than those that live there, or like Chinese, have a need to get from one side to the other, are using that route. The Russians continue to be serious about their Arctic business. Here are 3 classes of vessels that are under development, and this one here, 2 are delivered out of 5 that are planned. This is a very large ship. It's nuclear powered, of massive power, 33,000 tons displacement. To put that in context, that's like so it's 5 times the displacement of INEOS. Okay, and it's good for 3 meters of ice. This one here is even bigger, and it's 70,000 tons, so twice as big again, and it's good for about 4 meters. The Russians have a different scheme of ice-breaking classifications, and so this 4 meters, it's above a PC1. They're kind of establishing a new scale for themselves. And this one is interesting because it's an armed patrol vessel that has a significant ice class, so it's good for 2 meters of ice. That's substantially more than our AOPS. It's about the same displacement as an AOPS, and about 2,000 tons heavier than a Canadian frigate, but it's armed like a frigate. 76 millimeter gun, close-in weapon system, and the caliber surface-to-surface missile. So that's a very capable naval vessel. It's definitely an ice-capable combat vessel, unlike the ice-capable constabulary vessel that we have in the Arctic Offshore Patrol ships. So where's all this going? This one first. So here again, this demonstrates, just how vast that area is that the Russians are looking at. A number of these straits here are shallow, just like the Canadian Arctic, and so the bigger ships have to take a much more northern route. Fortunately for them, the northern sea route is passable by non-ice class vessels, generally with some sort of ice-breaking escort for a much longer period. So in that sense, it is possible and it's more attractive, particularly for vessels that are bringing oil and gas out of the Yamal oil fields in here. But a lot of attention recently has been paid to the Russians building up their military facilities in the Arctic. And what's that about? Well, a lot of people look at that and say, well, they're ready to pick a fight with someone. Well, maybe they're only looking to pick a fight with someone that's coming into their north to pick a fight with them. And who would do that? Well, not us, not the Americans, I don't think. Maybe the Chinese. It remains to be seen. But in any case, what they're doing is they're building up, reestablishing, or perhaps establishing for the first time, bases across these Arctic islands and other facilities, and it has largely to do with their responsibilities for surveillance and patrol and search and rescue in the north. But they are also wary about the vulnerability of their northern infrastructure and resource industries. Frankly, in my view, they only are doing what we would be doing if we had that much interest in our own north. Bear that in mind as we go forward. So are we looking at a Cold War here? Definitely the Arctic's becoming more accessible. I think I've proven that with some caveats about the length of the season, the type of ice class that you would need to navigate safely through that. We're going to see more traffic through there. That's a certainty. I've shown that a lot of that to date has been very small stuff, and that's sometimes a challenge to keep track of. But the SAR responsibilities are going to increase because of that. Of course, the nation's sovereign responsibilities are going to be met with increasing military and paramilitary presence. And why is that? It's not necessarily because we expect a military challenge in the north, but frankly, because that's where the government has the greatest operational capacity. Okay, so in the Americans' situation, the Coast Guard is an armed force. They're dovetailed with the Army, Navy, and Air Force in the defense of the nation, and so they're part of that kind of defense umbrella. For us, it's the Coast Guard. But notwithstanding that, it's the Coast Guard and the Navy that have the ability to move on the water in the Arctic with any kind of presence. And albeit limited, if the government want any more of that, they'd be asking us to do it, not necessarily because it's a military role. It's just because, we're the source of, or we're the resource of choice. There's going to be a continued competition. I'll say a little bit more about that in the next slide. But the real question here is, if you're thinking that there's a Cold War brewing, what's the incentive for states to challenge others' positions on Arctic sovereignty? I've already told you the Americans don't really have an interest in challenging us in the Northwest Passage. That would be kind of contrary to their own interests, because we're partners in North American defense, and they don't want to be undercutting our sovereignty just to make a point. However, they're not in a position to agree with us because of the maritime law precedents in other areas like the South China Sea. So is this Arctic a new military arena or just a penalty box? When people talk about conflict or competition in the North, they're usually referring to this chart here. And it's an awkward chart because it's not really very clear, but the solid areas here are the exclusive economic zone. So here's across Alaska, across the Canadians. That's Denmark's claim around Norway. You can see where the Norwegian claim interfaces with that. And then the striped parts are the extended continental shelf claims and submissions that have been sent to the International Commission on the continental shelf. And various countries are trying to make arguments for extending the claim, and it has to do with access to seabed resources, which is largely hypothetical. I mean, it may be real in terms of the science identifying the potential for valuable resources on the seabed, but practically speaking, because of the ice, because of the depth of the water, and various other considerations, it's not a viable resource that's demanding immediate extraction that people can fight over practically. Notwithstanding that, Canada has an extensive claim that extends into the Arctic Basin here. Denmark, their claim follows the Lomonosov Ridge here towards Russia, and correspondingly the Russia claim comes all the way back to this side, okay, right up against the Greenland EEZ. So the contention in the Arctic is largely around the Lomonosov Ridge, and people will portray that as a fight over sovereignty. Okay, it's not a fight over absolute sovereignty, but it's a potential disagreement or a competition that still has to be resolved regarding who gets access rights to the hypothetical resources. For years now, the Arctic Council has been a forum for discussing these kinds of issues, and largely speaking, everyone agrees that the Arctic Council is a good forum for debating Arctic issues, reaching a consensus or agreement, or at least shared perspectives on some of those challenges. And then, so we've got here the coastal states, the 5 coastal states. We've got the other northern members of the Arctic Council, and then the rest of these are observers, and they're in alphabetical order. They're not in order of prominence or importance. But there's China, who's a recent joiner as an observer to the Arctic Council. And people say, well, why is China there? What interest do they have? But you could just as easily ask, what interest does India have, or Italy, or here's another one, Singapore, good Arctic nation there. What they have an interest in is the science of the North, which is understood as a bellwether for climate change globally. It's accelerating, it's more evident in the North, and so that's where we're tracking the effects. And so these are the interests of the Arctic observers, science, climate change, navigation routes. This one is really an outlier. I think I've shown you that we do not have an ice-free Arctic, okay, and no one's transiting across the North Pole yet and won't be for many years to come. But nevertheless, they're interested and they want to get their ore in there so that they have a stake in this when it becomes open for trade. And I want to clarify something about the terminology of waters too. There's territorial waters, which are sovereign waters, okay, and then there's the extended economic zone, okay, and then there's the waters behind that. But the extended economics, or the exclusive economic zone of 200 miles, and the waters beyond that, that's all international waters, okay, that's the high seas. So the only national waters are the territorial waters, okay, and people frequently confuse the discussion by talking about Canada's sovereignty over Canadian waters, by which they mean the exclusive economic zone. So limited rights over the exclusive economic zone, full sovereignty over the territorial seas. So the fears of the Arctic states is that some of these observers will somehow shoehorn their way into a discussion and drive the debate on things that are really pertinent and important to the coastal states, where those observers don't have the same sort of stake in it. So there's vulnerabilities, threats, and challenges. We've talked through some of these things here. I'm not going to dwell on those. The threats could be foreign capabilities and capacities, what incentives, as I said, and then here, foreign investment in resource industries. But people talk about these vulnerabilities and threats as if they're direct challenges, and they're not. There are very few direct challenges in Canada's north. There are absolutely no disputes about territorial responsibilities and rights, and there's only a few disagreements that we have with the Americans regarding our borders in the Beaufort Sea. So it comes down to this perennial intelligence conundrum: is how do these capabilities and opportunities stack up against foreign intent? Are there nefarious designs at work there, and what does it look like in the future? Here's some quotes from our latest defense policy or statement, the 3rd of May. I've highlighted where they're talking about China and Russia. There's 85 mentions of Arctic through there, and a lot of mentions of China and Russia. And largely, this is playing to public sentiment to motivate interest in the North. And this statement caught my eye. The red highlighting there and the question marks are mine. The most urgent and important task we face is asserting Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic and northern regions. Well, frankly, in the wake of the Ukraine-Russia war, in terms of the continuing tension in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Straits, and not least the recent American election, I think we've got a lot bigger fish to fry than worrying about our north. So that's my conclusion. Resource exploitation, largely hypothetical. It's in uncontested areas. We're unlikely to see the North as a military resupply route. It's just too difficult, too limited, and too fraught with restrictions and constraints. And it's unlikely for similar reasons to become a critical trade route. Here, navies are hard-pressed to capitalize temperate water capabilities, let alone acquire Arctic-capable vessels of dubious military utility. And in that bracket, I would put the AOPS. I think it's been a gross distraction to the Navy. to have to take those Arctic offshore patrol ships at a time when we're short of technicians and crews for the frigates, and we're bleeding expertise on the combat-capable vessels for vessels that have a really marginal constabulary role, and they're really not spending that much time in the Arctic at this point. But there is a northern threat axis, okay, even if there's not a military objective or physical challenge to the north, by which I mean it's still a threat axis for NATO. We need to have surveillance in that direction. We need to be able to respond to potential missile strikes. In the very real sense of a Cold War, not a frigid war, but a Cold War between ourselves and the Russians, okay, we're beginning to revive our attention to the north and our anxiety about Russian future intentions. And the Chinese are a spoiler in this because they're not directly engaged, but they're engaged in ways that are subtle and patient and may result in economic rather than physical infiltration. And we know that they have been trying to buy Canadian resource industries in the north, and it's a matter of getting in there, investing heavily, and then becoming indispensable for social and economic sustainment in the north. And so that's a big threat. And the people that I talk to, some are apt to raise the flag and say that there is a threat and a challenge in the north, and others say, it's just not that obvious, but there's something there that we've got to keep our eye on. And the question is, are others in our Arctic surreptitiously learning about it and understanding it in the way that we don't? Okay? I think, again, that's kind of, it's leaning forward on the kind of the threat axis, perhaps more than I would do personally, but it's something to consider. And with that, I'll thank you and take your questions. Yes, sir.
Concerned about search and rescue with the IMO and ICAO responsibilities, do they extend right out to our economic zone?
The search and rescue responsibilities?
Yeah.
Well, in the diagram I showed you, Canada's search and rescue responsibility goes all the way to the pole. We own that sector for search and rescue.
We just don't have any equipment to cover it.
No, some of our heavier icebreakers during summer months can make it to the pole and have done that. And to be fair, there's not a lot of traffic up by the pole that we'd have to rescue, but if for example, the Commandant Charcot, that Ponant cruise ship, got stuck on the way to pole and he was in our sector, then that would be our problem. In terms of ICAO, kind of air traffic concerns, yeah, that's our area. Yes, sir.
You say a few words about the transits by submarines. Who's doing it? Is it frequent?
Yeah, I would refer you to a book by Adam Lejeunesse called Lock, Stock, and Icebergs. He managed to get hold of a lot of documentation from the U.S. that was declassified and showed submarine transit routes. And so we know that the Americans have been, all through the Northwest Passage in routes that are suitable to submarines. Okay, and there's some of those, but not as many as you would think, because the problem with submarines is that they need clearance below and above. So if they're under the water and they're under the ice when it ridges up, you see it on top, it's rafted up, but there's a keel that goes with it too, and in the worst case, those keels can be as deep as 50 meters. So if a submarine's navigating in 200 meters of water, of which the top 50 meters is taken out, and there's a safety distance there, and then there's the depth of the submarine, and then there's a safety distance in the bottom, he's not got a lot of room to maneuver. Okay, so many of the Arctic straits, even if they're navigationally wide enough for traffic, for submarine traffic, they're just not safe to go under the ice. Yeah, but they have been through the Canadian Arctic in various ways. And the first Northwest Passage transit of an American nuclear submarine happened in 1956 or 57, I think, and it was a Sea Dragon. And they had a Canadian Commodore on board as the ice navigator, former submariner himself. So a lot of that work is done in partnership, secretly, of course, because that's the nature of the business, with Canada. So, occasionally the media get hold of it and raise the red flag. Hey, the Americans are challenging our sovereignty. No, they're not. They're working with us. Yes, ma'am, at the end of the table.
Thank you. and the Americans lost there. In the middle on the way, they met the Soviet icebreaker, or Russian icebreaker, with school children on board who performed a dance on the ice for the Americans and Canadians, as told me by the captain of the American icebreaker. What I want to know is, how do you see Canada's responsibility with defending the totality of the routes through the North Atlantic? They've also steadfast defender on line exercises in this summer, and how did Canada perform?
I'm not well enough connected with the Navy to report on recent operations, so I can't tell you about that. I can tell you that I was off on the coast of central West Greenland this summer when I heard one of the Canadian Arctic Offshore Patrol vessels hailing another vessel, and this was the beginning or kind of second week of August, and I thought, oh, good, the AOPs are on their way into the Arctic for the season, and no, they weren't. They were on the way out of the Arctic because they had other duties to perform, and I thought, what the hell? We just built a ship to patrol the Arctic during the navigational season, and they're coming out of the Arctic just as the season is starting. So that's as much as I can report from personal experience of the Canadian operations for the Navy.
Because it seems that the whole question of access from the Mars into the Atlantic is still as topical as it has been for 100 years ago.
Certainly in terms of naval strategy, the focus is on the northeast Atlantic, the famous Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, GI-UK gap, and strategies for containing the Russians in the Barents Sea by having, forward deployed anti-submarine barriers and patrols in that area. But that's really outside the domain of Arctic navigation because it's ice-free waters. Yeah. Notwithstanding that it's high latitudes and horrible weather, but it's ice-free.
It is after all the whole of the Arctic that is involved in this, as far as I understand. And the Americans have not really done very much. For example, I was at Tulip in the early 2000s, and it was very interesting to see how the people maintained the Tulip.
What?
On the Tula Air Base.
Yes. Yeah.
It was 300
Yeah.
in a base for the Vancouver.
Yeah, still a significant presence there, and some of my colleagues in Maritime polar consultants who broker ice navigators for various concerns, we're doing a couple voyages a year and they supply up to Thule. Yeah.
But it was rather strange to see. And when the bridge between the airport and the fire station for the airport in Thule was washed away by the first real great event of outwash from under the glacier, they couldn't have the airport open.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things that became apparent to me, I joined the ship in Kangerlussuaq, which is a 100-mile deep inlet on the central west coast of Greenland. It was the site of one of the major U.S. air bases during the war. And one of the books in the ship's library was about the U.S. air bases in Greenland, and there were something like 8 of them. And it's really a fascinating lesson in military logistics and strategic positioning that they built those air bases and staffed them and built up the infrastructure in just a couple of years to support the ferry of aircraft into Europe. Question there, sir.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. That was terrific. Now, the work you're doing in the summers and the voyages you're going on, how robust is our research through the various institutions, government, research departments, universities? How robust is it in the north? What should we be doing?
Well, I can speak mostly from the perspective of the Canadian Ice Service and the products they give us for navigating. So during the navigational season, in various segments of the Arctic, the Canadian Ice Service publishes daily ice charts of ice type and coverage by percentages, by type of ice, so that we can do the figures and determine if a ship of our ice class can safely move through there. And we have to do that in correspondence with Transport Canada to get approval to move through the north. So they're doing this daily. It's a matter of satellite observation from Canadian radar sat constellations, synthetic aperture radar, and ground truth by aerial patrols, and then ship reports and that kind of stuff. So that information comes to us. It may be, anywhere from 12 to 24 hours time late. But when we're mapping, or when we're encountering the ice edge and we're looking at the most recent chart, there's a correspondence of plus or minus a couple miles. So it's very accurate, very high quality indeed, and the Canadian Ice Service is as good as any the world over. The problem is many of those radar sat constellations are going to be timing out recently, and so there's a challenge to the Canadian government to repopulate those, to invest in space-based assets, not just for space-based observation for ice, but space-based observation with space-based AIS monitoring for ship monitoring and surveillance, and also for environmental monitoring and all the rest that goes with that. So there's real challenges for the Canadian government in investing both in military capabilities and civil space-based capabilities. And when I think about what the Russians are doing in their north, their icebreakers, their military establishments, their infrastructure, and their resource development, okay, they've been at it over a much wider area with a command-based economy for a lot longer than we have, so they have some certain advantages. But if we look at that and say it's nefarious, well, it isn't. It's just effective. And we should turn the mirror around and say, Canadians, you got to do better. That's the bottom line. Yes, Stan.
You said that you weren't terribly concerned about, say, an incursion in the Arctic, but we should keep our eye on it. I did the Arctics of Iowa course in Resolute, and it always seemed to me, looking back on that we should certainly have a military base in the Arctic, and Resolute seems to me to be an ideal central location with an airfield and build up an infrastructure where we could have a permanent base. I could have your opinion about putting your military suit back on.
Okay, Scott's giving me the eye here. I'm going to get the hook shortly, but I'll answer your question.
5 more minutes.
And then I'll be available if anyone wants to hack me afterwards. Well, Resolute, there is an airfield at Resolute. I flew out of Resolute at the end of my tasking this summer. So they got a small community there. They got an airfield, and it is the site of the Canadian Army's Arctic training facility. So people will deploy there periodically to do that. The problem with establishing a base in the north is that there's just not enough reason to keep people in the north year-round. Okay, and it's a very challenging environment, and more people there, the more sustainment required. There's no pier in Resolute. It's just a bay. It's more often than not it's encumbered with ice. Okay. Strangely, when I was there at the end of my tour this year, it was us, the Ultramarine, and 3 Coast Guard ships having to congregate there at once, which was pretty poor distribution of assets, I would say. But there's people are thinking about that kind of thing, but they're not leaning forward aggressively. But what they are trying to do is they're trying to establish relationships with the North. And so it may please you or interest you to know that each of the Arctic offshore patrol ships, notwithstanding they're named for Canadian heroes, and the first one was named after Admiral Harry de Wolf, but each of those ships has a namesake relationship with a different Inuit region in the north. And so they visit the communities in that region, and they establish relationships, and the idea is that the northern people should identify with the ship and hopefully encourage some of the young people to train and join the Navy or the Coast Guard, and then have a greater role in policing and being modern mariners in their traditional environment. So one more question, and then we'll let you go, but I will be available to talk afterwards. Yes, sir.
Earlier this morning, I heard that the new Secretary of Defense designate for the United States is the weekend news anchor for Fox News.
That's
But-
particularly
but-
encouraging, isn't it?
Well, but no apparent qualification for the job. The president-elect is on record many times as saying that a group of nations, including Canada, who aren't pulling their weight in terms of defense, should be left, to the good graces of the Russians or whoever. I'm just wondering whether, with the new regime coming in Washington, whether you anticipate any changes in what's going on in the Arctic and our north.
I don't expect any difference in the North within the time frame or the term of that president. Just because that's a very short timeline to get anything accomplished. We think, how long it's taken us to get Civic refueling facility sort of operational for a very limited period of time. It's quite concerning. I think Canada will be under massive pressure to increase their military spending. The government will probably try to do that first by counting everything that is peripherally related to defense as within the defense budget or the defense contribution to NATO. But even let's suppose, next year the government had an epiphany and decided to give the military 2% of the GDP. That would represent something like a 30 or 40%, perhaps even more, increase in the military budget. There's just no way we could spend it that fast. Okay? If we were to see that kind of an increase over 4 or 5 years, I don't think we'd be able to spend it then. Because what it takes is such a revolution and an advance on such a wide front of initiatives in order to spend that kind of money and get good value for it. And it would have to start with massive raises of pay for military people, okay? Not to achieve parity with the civil service, but to exceed it substantially in order to attract good people and retain them, okay? It would take a massive fix in the procurement system so that it wouldn't take us 15 or 20 years to build a ship, but that we could build it in Russian-like time frames. Okay? It would take a re-energizing of Canadian defense industry to build up stockpiles of munitions that have been donated to Ukraine and would continue to need to be donated to Ukraine, perhaps even more so under the new term. And all those kind of things, and the real bottleneck is even if you were able to attract all those people that could man an increased fleet and army and air force, you've got a serious problem of vacancies in the mid-grades of military officers and non-commissioned members, which are the key people needed to train and get people into service. And so you'd have to have some really innovative solutions, perhaps to call back retired military folk that could fill the training role and then expedite the movement of people into effective grants. So it's a really, really what they call a wicked problem. It's not really susceptible to a simple analysis.
A serious attempt at building some housing for the military.
That too, yes. That would
would
be
take an awful lot.
that would be part of the attraction too.
That would
So-
be the best way.